GamingBolt presents 15 worst games of 2017 so far. There's no doubt that 2017 is one of the best years we've seen in the video game industry, right there with 2007 and 1998. Just look at the games we've already played this year: The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, Horizon Zero Dawn, Persona 5, and Nier Automata, just to name a few. And there's still so much more that has yet to come. We're still only halfway through the year yet. But that doesn't mean there has not been bad games this year. Expecting something like that to happen is ultimately unreasonable and unrealistic, regardless of how many masterpieces you get in a specific year. Sure, having been able to play so many great games this year has made the impact of the opposite end of the spectrum a lot less sour, but there have been some games that just couldn't match up. Here in this list, we're going to take a look at what we feel have been the 15 worst games of 2017 so far. As always, we know that some of you might not agree with our list, so leave behind your feedback in the comment section below. The Caligula Effect. The Caligula Effect actually looked kind of interesting before it launched. It looked like one of those niche JRPGs that the PS Vita seems to have so many of, the kind that slips under the radar but still leaves a mark on its own way. What it ended up being was an uninspired, mostly bland game that seemed to borrow a lot from its peers but couldn't implement any of it half as well. Add to that other problems like major performance issues and uninteresting characters, and it turned out to be a massive disappointment. 1-2 Switch. No one expected 1-2 Switch to be among the best games of the year or anything. When you really get down to it, it's hardly even a game. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a collection of minigames that served as an advertisement for some of the Switch's most unique capabilities. Unfortunately though, it ended up feeling like a half-baked attempt at making something mildly fun, with not nearly enough content to keep anyone interested for long. Rise and Shine. There were a lot of people who were actually looking forward to Rise and Shine. It looked like an interesting throwback to the retro side-scrolling shoot-'em-ups of the old days. What it is, though, is a drab and cheerless game that has next to no interesting mechanics, and almost everything it attempts to do, it does poorly. From the shooting to the platforming, there's not nearly enough meat on its bones, and all of it feels more like a chore than any fun activity. Berserk and the Band of the Hawk. Berserk and the Band of the Hawk felt like such a major disappointment, not because we expected too much from it, but because it falls in a genre that desperately deserves a good game. Instead, what we got was an amalgamation of a drab, rudimentary combat that is as uninspired as it is boring, bland level design, and a sense of monotony and repetition that was prevalent throughout the entire experience. Troll and I. Troll and I has to be lauded for at least being a game with many ambitions, but that is exactly what works so badly against it. It tries too many things at the same time, and sadly enough, it doesn't succeed at any of them. You can see that the ideas it has are often interesting on paper, but the game itself is a confused mess that is riddled with pervasive issues such as obnoxious glitches and terrible voice work. Perception. Like a lot of games on this list, there were undoubtedly a few things Perception did well. It had a legitimately interesting narrative style, and on paper, it had strong thematic messages. However, when you actually got down to the act of playing the game, it turned out to be a boring experience with predictable and cliched horror imagery. Perception felt more like a chore than it did a game, and that is never a good thing. Dead Effect 2. Dead Effect 2 is a truly ambitious indie project in that it tries to mimic everything you'd expect to see in a AAA game. It fails at almost all of it. The shooting in the game is bland, the level design is uninspired, there's not nearly enough variety in the gameplay, and the story is such a mess that it makes you wonder why the game even bothered with it in the first place. The fact that there's so much content on offer but that none of it is even mildly interesting shows that this is a textbook example of quantity over quality. Has-Been Heroes. How can the same people who made the excellent Trine games follow up that series with this extremely forgettable game? Has-Been Heroes looked interesting on paper with its roguelike gameplay, but when it launched, we realized that it was far from interesting. It's repetitive, shakily structured, and mechanically weak. And while at first it may seem like an enjoyable game in short bursts, the more you play it, the more you realize that the first impression is about as far as that game will ever go. Friday the 13th, the game. To be fair, there's a lot that Friday the 13th gets right. It's a faithful video game adaptation of a well-respected property, one that builds up the atmosphere from the movies rather well, and when you're playing as Jason himself, well, the game is actually a lot of fun. But it feels like a little more polish would have gone a long way towards making this game feel like a finished product rather than what it is right now. Despite all of its positive aspects, Friday the 13th, the game, is a letdown by tons of bugs and glitches and an uneven, lopsided multiplayer gameplay. Syberia 3. Syberia 3 has a fairly interesting setting, one that is elevated thanks to some great artwork. Unfortunately though, in almost every other area that actually counts, the game falters. It's plagued by technical issues, awful lip syncing, stilted dialogue, and an uninteresting script. The game's been awaited by fans of its predecessors for a long, long time, and it's a real shame that the wait has ended in such bitter disappointment. DEFORMERS. It's hard to believe that this game is developed by Ready at Dawn, who've had a pretty good track record up until now. Even The Order 1886 wasn't a completely horrible game. DEFORMERS, though, despite the few rare moments of fun that it provides, and despite having a rather good soundtrack, is ultimately a broken game with terrible mechanics and some very bland level design. It's not a game that you could rightly recommend to anyone, and it truly makes you wonder why a developer like Ready at Dawn is wasting its talents on something like this. MOTO Racer 4. MOTO Racer 4 isn't the kind of game that has any single mechanic that is so horribly broken that it ends up being downright unplayable. By all accounts, it's a middling game in all regards. It has fidgety controls, its visuals seem horribly dated, and it doesn't have nearly enough content to keep players interested for long enough. It's not like MOTO Racer 4 is the worst game of the genre that you'll ever play, but it's a largely forgettable experience that you probably shouldn't be wasting your money on. Not when there are other games out there in the same genre that are so much better. Dying Reborn. With a name as silly as Dying Reborn, you really wouldn't expect this game to amount to much. Surprisingly, it makes a decent first impression on players. It has a good atmosphere when you first get into it, and the escape room concept is an exciting one, but it ends up feeling repetitive and unfinished. Dying Reborn often almost feels like a pre-alpha, a small demo that could be used as a pitch for an idea. You feel like if the developers had spent more time and resources on expanding this idea, they might have had something good on their hands. As it stands right now though, that just isn't the case. Reservoir Dogs Bloody Days. Reservoir Dogs Bloody Days could have been a decent experience that made use of an unlikely license, but it isn't. It has some interesting ideas, sure, and at times it can be a mildly enjoyable experience, but it just feels half-assed in everything that it attempts. From its characters and technical aspects to its boring, repetitive mission design, Bloody Days is by no means a game that you need to try out. VROOM in the Night Sky. VROOM in the Night Sky is an inexcusably terrible game. It's boring, it's broken, it's asinine, and it's no damn fun at all. We wonder why anyone would want to make such a game at all. Hell, we wonder if this is even a game. And that'll be about it for this one. If you guys like what we're doing at GamingBolt, please consider subscribing to our channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.